My name is Mary Jane Warden, and I'm with the Natural Therapies Education Foundation. And I'm privileged to introduce our panel today. I'm going to start at the far end because that's Ben, and I didn't do a bio for you, Ben. I'm sorry. So this has been Bonemir. I wasn't sure how to pronounce your name either. Thank you. This is our esteemed panelist, esteemed moderator today. Sitting next to Ben is Ohio Representative Ron Ferguson. Representative Ferguson was elected to the Ohio House of Representatives as Republican in 2020 to represent District 96 on the far eastern side of the state. In December 2021, he and Representative Jamie Callender from District 61 introduced HB 498 that would permit the adult marijuana cultivation and possession. Okay. Sitting next to him is Jody Salvo, and Jody is a licensed social worker and director of substance use prevention services with Ohio Guidestone, a nonprofit that offers community counseling, substance use disorder treatment, and other services. She's also the coordinator of the Tuscarawas County Anti-Drug Coalition. And next we have Kat Packer. And Kat is the former executive director of the Department of Cannabis Regulation for the City of Los Angeles, having just stepped down from that position. And this capacity, she advised the city on cannabis law, policy, and regulation, and oversaw the city's licensed commercial cannabis market. Next, we have Keller Mcmurray, is a founding partner of the law firm McMurray & Schuster. Her practice areas include regulatory compliance along with cannabis CBD hemp. Her extensive background in consumer protection offers the unique insights into regulatory and compliance issues. And finally, in the end here, we have Tom Heron. And Tom is a partner and cannabis practice chair for the Cleveland-based law firm of Franz Ward. He spearheaded the Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol ballot initiative, which is an initiated statute for which sufficient signatures have been collected to place it before consideration before the Ohio General Assembly. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you for the introductions. I want to say a special thank you to Professor Doug Berman and also to Yana and to the Drug Enforcement Policy Center. It's the reason we're here, actually, and I think, Doug, you're not necessarily one to beat the drum as loudly as I think it deserves, but this center is an incredible resource locally as well as nationally. You can see listed on the sign some of the goals that the center espouses, but among that are included academic initiatives like the classes that Professor Berman and others, myself included, are able to teach and engage students in this space, regulatory research, including student-led as well as professional academic, and policy and conversational shaping within the industry, events like this, which are all beautifully coalescing together in this wonderful cloud of academic thought and actual policy that's turning into action. So first of all, I just want to say thank you. There are incredible resources on that website, including the results of some of those student papers. And some of those student papers, I think to an earlier panelist's point, are on topics that no one has ever looked at before. It wasn't taught when you went to law school. It's being taught to me as someone who is allegedly teaching students. They're actually teaching me every single time. So those student papers are incredible. I encourage everyone to go on that website and look around and look for those papers. I want to thank all the panelists for being here. We have an incredible group and I want to get them going. And maybe at first, I think it'd be helpful to start with what I think is probably, if there's a person I might be able to say is a primary catalyst for the current conversation around the potential adult use ballot initiative. Will it become a law? Will it not? I think you could start with one of the architects of that effort. And I'd like to do that starting with Tom on the end. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of a high-level view for those who are tuning in online, who are here in person, of what is being proposed, why now? What is it, why now? A couple minutes on that and we can come down the line in terms of just initial reactions to, is this the time? Is this the initiative?
Sure. So I'll answer the second question first. Why now? There are two reasons, I think, primarily. The first is Ohio has a functioning medical marijuana program that, from a public policy standpoint, has actually worked really well. We heard from Senator Huffman about things that the legislature can do to correct or modify some of the ways that our program was structured. But if you go back in time to 2016 and the opponents to House Bill 523, they warned us about all these boogeymen that were going to show up if we legalize medical marijuana, and none of them showed up. So right now we have a functioning industry that is serving hundreds of thousands of patients without the bad public policy outcomes. So we think that sort of sets the table for thinking about what do we do next with this substance. I mean, we know that it can be regulated. We know that it can be used productively, effectively in the state of Ohio. So how does the program develop from there? But the other reason, and I think the primary reason, is that we see what's happening at the federal level. And Ohio, like a lot of states, has a law in statute that says if the federal government changes the federal drug schedules, if it removes a substance from the controlled substances list, if it adds a substance or it changes the scheduling of substances, whatever that changes is automatically affected under state law. And so what that means is if the federal government deschedules marijuana, like is currently being proposed, for example, under the MORE Act, which just passed the House of Representatives, marijuana overnight would become legal, unregulated, untaxed, untested, able to be sold by anybody to anyone at any time, no matter if you're 21 or 11. That's a really bad public policy outcome. So we think that Ohio should be proactive on this issue, recognizing that a change is going to happen at the federal level, and we don't want to have some knee-jerk reaction for a relatively big public policy change. So that's the answer to the second question. First question, what are we trying to do? Well, we think the name of the coalition says a lot about it. We want to regulate marijuana like alcohol. So if our proposal becomes law, it would be legal for anybody older than 21 to possess up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana or up to 15 grams of marijuana in extract form. It would build upon the existing medical marijuana infrastructure because, again, we have a system that is set up and is working. There are no hard caps for licenses under our proposal. In contrast to some earlier proposals, there are opportunities for expansion and new licenses, including within the first 9 months under the statute, 40 new additional cultivator licenses with a preference for social equity applicants, 50 new dispensary licenses with a preference for social equity applicants. Our proposal would legalize home grow. So if you're an adult, you can grow up to 6 plants in your home or up to 12 plants in your household in locked, enclosed areas that aren't visible to the public, not easily accessible to children, to address some of the concerns that Senator Huffman had. Would implement a 10% tax at the point of sale for adult use cannabis products. By some estimates, including an estimate by a Drug Enforcement Policy Center student a couple of years ago, Finley Newman James, who wrote an article sort of extrapolating data from Colorado and framing it with Ohio's population, that we could generate through an adult use program around $400 million in new tax revenue to the state that we would earmark to very specific causes, including on $144 million to social equity components to do things like studying and funding criminal justice and bail and sentencing reform, to make direct investments in areas that have been hit the hardest by the war on drugs, to provide loans and grants to social equity participants within the new adult use marijuana industry. So that's, I mean, really at a high level, we want to make sure that we're ending the failed policy of marijuana prohibition and putting in place a regulated framework very similar to the way we regulate alcohol.
Great. Well, something you just referenced, the failed policy. I heard an interesting statement on the previous panel that the reason we're all here is a failure by our federal government. I think that's fantastic that there's what seems to be a bipartisan cacophony of agreement on the topic that our federal government has spectacularly failed in some way or another, I won't editorialize now, as to this topic of regulation of cannabis. Is this the right legislation? Is this going to be helpful? Is this should this be on the ballot? Should the state legislature actually take it up and do something with it, which they still have some time to do, I believe, until the end of May. That's correct. So maybe Helen, come to you down the line and get your thoughts.
I would say yes, very much so.
Good answer.
Yeah. I've been involved in two areas primarily, and the first is with regards to increasing the diversity of cannabis ownership. And we were involved with trying to maintain the constitutionality of the minority set aside from the original program. And it was just an awful battle. And we heard in the last panel from Tasha about some of the other issues that are out there, such as training, and then the issue with regards to individuals that have been disproportionately impacted by the cannabis industry as it being illegal, and things that can be done for them. And so to hear all of the social equity issues that Tom is talking about that comes within this program, it's addressing so many issues where they, I mean, I don't want to say a failure for the minority communities, but it was exceptionally challenging and quite frankly, demoralizing. I had a Black female client who had somebody show up at her door from the state to take her picture to prove that she was Black. So those kind of things have got to be, cannot occur again. And there's got to be a significant programs that address it. The second area is an entirely different area, and that's with regards to the products that would be sold. As an advertising attorney, I deal with claim substantiation. And we were chatting before the session today about how hard that is to do with the limitations on research that are out there. I was part of the tobacco settlement many years ago, and its main focus on advertising was advertising to children. And if you look and see what's out in other markets, you're already seeing, Snoopy and SpongeBob-like characters being used to promote brands. You've got flavors that are cotton candy that appeal to children. And so we have to expect that advertising is going to expand in Ohio. And we really need to deal with the issue of making sure that it's not targeted towards children like we're seeing now.
Great. Kat, you are here, but
I am here.
you are here now. You were not here fairly recently, and in fact, we're in a fairly significant regulatory role in Los Angeles. So seeing what we're looking at now, we're looking at a medical marketplace that's thinking about becoming an adult use marketplace. I think you have been very much in the center of a Wild West marketplace that lives next door to an allegedly fully regulated marketplace that lives next door to something that's in the middle, and strange leakage between the two. What do you have to say for Ohio as we are looking at this possibility, moving from medical to the possibility of adult use, lessons that you've learned from what I think is, the most lucrative unregulated and most lucrative regulated marketplace in the United States, and certainly much larger geographically than that. It goes outside the United States, I know. What lessons do you have for us in the context of thinking about this potential move to adult use?
Well, I'd like to think that I have many lessons learned at this point, but I think that the reality is that we're always going to be learning lessons about drug policy and cannabis policy reform. As I had the opportunity to serve as the first executive director of the City of Los Angeles's Department of Cannabis Regulation, and now this program being in its 5th year, I've had an opportunity to see from start to finish what legalization through implementation looks like for an adult use program. And there are innumerable amounts of challenges that communities, stakeholders, businesses, patients will go through. But the reality is that it is our responsibility collectively to address them. So I'd like to first articulate that while I see that there is a historic failure by the federal government, I think it's one that has to be acknowledged as a shared failure across the board and a shared responsibility for us to address moving forward. I'm excited to see that Ohio has a number of different opportunities to move cannabis policy reform forward. And I'm also excited to see that these efforts are increasingly centered around equity. That's part of the reason why I got involved in cannabis policy reform. I had an opportunity. It seems like much longer ago, Doug. But
Well, I've aged a lot, you have.
yeah, you know, and cannabis years sometimes feel like dog years in the space. And so graduated from Ohio State University in 2015, took Doug's class in 2015, actually worked for that controversial campaign back in 2015 because I was interested in learning all that I could about cannabis policy reform, and ultimately realized at the time that I was going to have to leave Ohio to be able to do the type of work that I was interested in. But I'm back in Ohio because this is where the work is. And so looking forward to being able to work with stakeholders in that regard. But I'll start with some initial words of caution, is that there's a lot that can be said about equity and the initiatives that have occurred to date to try and promote equity. But I think there really needs to be a centering of equity in these conversations, and it really has to go beyond equity and licensing. When we talk about the failed policies of the war on drugs, we weren't talking about licensing in that aspect. We were talking about folks losing opportunities to vote, to go to school, to have housing. And these are the types of things that need to be addressed by reform. So I am excited to see things like community reinvestment initiatives and significant amounts of funding being dedicated to those types of provisions. But it's always going to be a work in progress. And hopefully we can get further into some of those lessons learned as we continue.
Perfect. I'm certain we will, and I'm eager to give you a couple of questions that help us juxtapose the two marketplaces. Jody, initial thoughts on currently proposed pathway that we're discussing, other alternative pathways to the possibility of adult use, or perhaps a different opinion as to whether either of those should take place?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me today. I have a little bit of a different hat because I am in the prevention world, substance use prevention, and I work in Ohio. And I just have to always preface this conversation that I think the first question was, is the timing right? You know, we're talking about a timing issue. I will tell you, coming out of a pandemic in a state that has been riddled with substance abuse and addiction, it is a hard time for me to say, hey, let's move forward, given we've had this failure of allowing research on cannabis. So we have two things that are going on. And even in the first panel, you know, as we're looking at Senate Bill 261, a lot of that's dependent on not really having the research to make informed decisions. So some of that Senate bill allows increased THC potency for medical efficacy without the research to show, is there any research to show 70, 90% THC is effective? So that's the medical piece. But then when we get into adult use, where it's concerning to me is I work in a rural county and it is riddled with addiction. In the first 6 months of 2020, we had a 283% increase in overdose death. So here's our community. We're dealing with anxiety, depression, other drug issues. And when we're talking about now putting increased drug exposure in our communities, that can be problematic. And some of the problems really come down to cannabis reform, because if you look at other states, you'll see something that happens over and over again. The disadvantaged communities often get the dispensaries. So in our county, all our more healthy communities already have ordinances to ban out dispensaries, but our at-risk communities, those hot spots for addiction and overdose, are the ones that do not, because I think there's some anticipation that we're going to receive funding. We will get the tax dollars. This will create more jobs. But when we look at other states, what we'll see is when those dispensaries are in disadvantaged communities, you see a uptick in illicit market. So I can already identify 2 areas where people are putting applications in for medical dispensaries, and we kind of know that medical can flip over to recreational. So it's very concerning for me right now that if we open up that adult use, where it's going to be located in my community are those at-risk communities. And then we do have research to support when there's dispensaries, there's more increased youth use. When there's dispensaries in advertising, we have increased youth use. So I know the program is adult use, but what happens in the science of prevention? It's all about perception of harm. So if we have billboards, we have storefronts, we have signages, we have dispensaries, and we have adults using, and they can be using responsibly over the age of 21. Our young people think it's safe, it's safer than alcohol, and I'll give it's probably safer than alcohol. However, the forms that young people use and how adults use cannabis can look very different. So if adults are feeling, hey, you know, this is my choice, this is how I'm going to recreate, and they're smoking a joint, whatever that looks like, that might not be what the young people are going to do. They're going to be looking at edibles, they're going to look at vaping, and those are higher THC potency products. So if you're under the age of 21, we know addiction is the more potent, the earlier the use, the more use, the better your chance for addiction. So there's a lot of concerns there. So sometimes when adults think of adult use, they think, well, this isn't for young people. Well, you know, alcohol isn't for young people, and we know plenty of young people that drink alcohol. But part of my caution is we still don't have the research. So we do not know what 90% THC is going to do to a 13-year-old brain who uses for 4 to 5 years. I know there's always that argument about a gateway drug, and I won't go there, but I will say if you're getting high at 13 consistently, the chance of needing harder, more drugs as you progress is definitely something that we can't ignore. So mine would be adult use comes advertising, which comes perception of harm, which then is increased youth use, which then adds to our problem with addiction that we're already fighting on a daily basis here in Ohio.
One thing I heard in there that I'm going to stick in my head is safer than alcohol. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I think, you know, part of what we've heard from a starting point, Tom, treat it like alcohol, right? Regulate it like alcohol. A bit of that interpretation for me is let's pass a federal amendment to get rid of it for 13 years and then stop caring about it forever. That'd be fine too. I'd be okay with that. But that's not the world we're living in. We're living in a world where in 2009, 0 states had an adult use marketplace. And a president came in who said that his relaxed views about cannabis would be reflected in the policies of the federal government. And we fast forward to today. At that time, there were 13 states with medical marketplaces. Fast forward to today, 38 with medical, and 18, it depends, you can quabble about what you're really counting with adult use marketplaces. And I think a trajectory that feels very much like a potential inevitability, but maybe not. So Representative Ferguson, Ron, if I can ask your thoughts about, as someone who comes from a hometown with 1 dispensary for every 2,500 people, which you know, I think is probably more than typical, which is not really a function of anything other than the strange allocation of where dispensaries were able to be located. Is this necessary, or is it going to be a federal solution? And if there is a federal solution, do we need to have done something at the state level to make sure that if a MORE Act or something similar were to pass, it wouldn't automatically open the floodgates for a completely unregulated Ohio marketplace? And I know I threw a lot at you. You can take pieces of that and you can go anywhere you want with it.
So I wouldn't use the word solution with federal at any point. They don't really have very many solutions. So that's probably not going to happen. But you did ask something early on that I really took note of, and it was, is now the right time? And I just double checked the date, but October 27th of 1970 is when the Controlled Substances Act passed, and that's when it became illegal to possess marijuana, and that was the right time. So we're 50 years behind right now. I wasn't even alive yet. I was born in 1986. So, but anyway, now is certainly the time because we're far past time. And as legislators, there's really only two things that we can ever do when we're legislating. And I say we can create barriers or we can break barriers. And I try to fall in that second category. And really, we just have this barrier of government standing between somebody making a decision in their own life. And just not really what we're sent there to Columbus to do. And it's not what the people are sent to Washington to do, but it's what we see them do. So anyway, it's my hope that we can move towards an adult use choice here in the state of Ohio.
Great. Well, on that topic, moving toward an adult use choice, let's say it doesn't happen just for a second. Can the medical marketplace flourish without that evolution? So are we really choosing between a well-functioning regulated marketplace or the victory of the illicit marketplace? Because I don't think it's a question of will cannabis be in Ohio? I think it's a question of what kind of cannabis and how safe is it and in whose hands will it ultimately be? So is it possible if this doesn't happen? What's the timeline? When do we need to solve this for the medical marketplace to not be taken over effectively by what I would call the illicit marketplace and maybe the out-of-state marketplace, which might be legal there, but it's certainly not legal to bring it here. Maybe start in reverse order, go back down the line.
Wow. Yeah, I would like to see us have a legislative solution, as we talked about earlier, and really get it accomplished within the state house. But I'm fearful that the folks in the state house are looking at more of a 5-year beyond plan. That's what we heard from Senator Huffman here a little bit ago. And you got, Tom at the other end here that's talking more about this year. And I tend to fall into his category. So maybe we could possibly get it done on the ballot if we're not going to get it done here in the legislature. But definitely the nice thing about doing it in the legislature is the fact that we have the ability to then change it if we don't exactly get it right. And of course, if we pass on the ballot, it's very hard to get back on the ballot again. And so don't want to have to go back and do that again.
Okay. Maybe a question to get back to Kat for a second. So different states and even cities and municipalities have taken very, very different approaches on the topic of social equity. Ohio, I think somewhat famously, had a provision for the medical application process that was challenged successfully as not being supported by research that showed a need for specific allocation of licenses based on lack of supporting research. Is this a national issue that has to be addressed nationally, or is this a state-by-state issue that the states should continue acting as these laboratories of democracy to choose their own path on social equity? Is it too great a responsibility for individual states to take up that responsibility, or is it something that that the federal government really needs to have a cohesive approach? Really, this is the split between MORE Act and a version of a States Act that says your state can do whatever it wants. Curious for your thoughts, having seen both, having seen states that and municipalities and cities that care deeply, focus intently on social equity as part of a solution to a maturing adult use marketplace as an alternative to the illicit marketplace. Which one is it, or is it something else that we're not currently talking about at the national level?
Yeah, and before I answer that question, Ben, I do just want to comment, appreciate you using the term illicit market. I've been trying to be intentional about vocabulary that we use in this space. And when I moved out to Los Angeles, I not only heard the term black market be used, but then white market started to be used as well. And I was like, what the hell is that? And so language is important, particularly when we're talking about cannabis policy reform and the history of cannabis, knowing that Black and brown communities suffer disproportionately. So I continue to try and encourage folks not to use the term black when it means illegal. That's what when we use the term black market, we mean illegal market. So I'm asking folks to say what they mean If you mean unregulated, if you mean unlicensed, in California, people like to call it the legacy market. But in terms of, and language is important. The question about who owns the responsibility of addressing equity. I think we can take a look back and ask, well, who has been responsible for inequity in cannabis policy? And the reality is that government at every level has been responsible for inequity. And so I think that everyone similarly should share a role in addressing disparities as they relate to drug policy reform and cannabis policy reform. I'm most passionate about equity issues. I led the City of Los Angeles's program that centered equity. We were one of the first jurisdictions in the nation to have an equity program. I think only the City of Oakland or City of San Francisco were first to address equity, but I can tell you today we have the largest program in the country. Just by way of comparison, just so folks can kind of understand where Ohio has the ability to expand. I think folks mentioned 50, 70 or so licenses. The City of Los Angeles, under my leadership, issued over 1,200 licenses. I've issued over 250 adult use retail licenses, and we have licenses that exist across the board. We actually put a provision in law almost 2 years ago at this point that limited the ability for folks to apply for retail licenses and delivery licenses to just equity applicants. So in the City of Los Angeles, you cannot apply for a delivery license or a retail license unless you are a social equity applicant. And part of the reason why we did that, and this is not just true for the state of California, it's true in almost every jurisdiction. And it was mentioned before, many of the medical operators will be the first to have opportunities to participate in adult use cannabis. And I don't know if my colleagues, folks who were here on the panel before are still in the room, but I'd be curious to know what the demographic and diversity numbers are of the medical programs. What are the demographics of your patients? What are the demographics of your physicians and caregivers? What are the demographics of the owners of the medical industry? Because if you copy and paste and allow those folks to have a head start for the adult use program, then you're going to start off with an inequitable cannabis industry. While there's been a lot of attention again placed on equity and licensing, though, I'm encouraged to see many jurisdictions expand this conversation about equity beyond licensing. I really think that the most important topic for jurisdictions to be discussing is the money, and that needs to be distributed in an equitable way. The reality is that only so many people, even if you have an uncapped market, only so many people are going to participate in the industry. There are many more communities that can be served when we reinvest cannabis tax revenue back into communities for things like housing, for things like education. So in conclusion, I think that everyone needs to be involved. I don't think that there's one particular jurisdiction that's got it completely right. Our process in the City of Los Angeles and California has been imperfect. But what I can tell you is that we've made progress in that regard. And the benefit that jurisdictions like Ohio have is that you can now look back to some of the mistakes that earlier jurisdictions made, some of the challenges and shortcomings of those jurisdictions. And every jurisdiction that has gone before should really only be setting the floor for reforms that are to come.
So a similar question, Helen, for you. So back to the federal conversation as it relates to this state conversation. And for those who weren't following along before, the States Act essentially was a version of let the states do whatever they're doing. If they're doing nothing, CSA, Controlled Substances Act, continues to do what it was doing. I.e., you could have illegality in one state, you could cross a border and suddenly be in a fully adult use marketplace. Helen, if a States Act passed, would you be okay with that? Or do you think there should be essentially a holding out or something that more comprehensively reflects a solution to what took place between 1970 and today.
Well, you had first asked about, can the medical market survive on its own? And I have a big no to that. I mean, it'll continue to hobble along. But the Department of Commerce is of the opinion that the one loan diversity provision is unconstitutional, even though a second court did find it constitutional. So there's nothing right now in medical marijuana to help economically disadvantaged communities. And then the second thing is that we're seeing kind of like this Bitcoin fervor over, Ohio is now on the precipice of becoming recreational, which means the entire country and many different companies in different states all want to be in one of those medical facilities so they can have it turned over. And there's, of course, nothing going on there that talks about any of the reforms that any of us are talking about. I think that something has to be done, and that there really should be something that is put together to if that federal switch is flipped, that will address all of these issues that we're talking about. And the other one is just the economics of it. I mean, I have my client that has dispensaries here in Ohio, and we went up to Detroit and we visited dispensaries there. And she's like, Helen, she said, I have that product in my high street store, no pun intended. And I charge twice as much for it because of the additional charges with regards to legal costs and taxes and things like that. So it's just not working well, and really something would need to be done by the state.
Okay. So I'm hearing a little bit of, we should be doing something at every level, first of all. We're going to do something, or people are interested in doing something at the state level to try to get ahead of whether or not something in a particular form takes place at the federal level. I want to go back in time 9 years to 2013, when then Attorney General Eric Holder condoned, I guess I would say, what was referred to as the second Cole Memorandum, which became known as the Cole Memo. And for those who don't know, it had as a federal law enforcement priority or deprioritization, not using federal law enforcement funds to stop state programs from existing, essentially. And that was expanded to essentially mean we won't stop the businesses from getting operational, we won't stop the customers from frequenting the businesses. The 8 things that were in that memo that said if, we won't go after them if, were, very quickly, number 1, and you'll like this one, distribution to minors, diversion of product for illegal purposes. Number 2, diversion of money to cartels and gangs. I would actually lump that in with number 4, which was state authorized activity being used as a front for illegal activity. And also number 5, violence, use of firearms, and cultivation, distribution. Number 3, though, was diversion of cannabis from legal states to illegal states. Is that already happening in the state of Ohio? And why is it?
Well, I can tell, yes, it's happening, not within our regulated medical marijuana program, but of course it's happening. And the reason it's happening is that prohibition doesn't eliminate markets. It eliminates oversight of markets. We have a very vibrant adult use market in the state of Ohio and across the country. It's called the unregulated market. So of course it's happening. We know that it's you go to a dispensary in Southern Michigan, you're going to see a parking lot full of cars with Ohio license plates. And in fact, there's at least one law professor, I believe from Vanderbilt, who has written an article saying that even the sort of state by state framework and the prohibition within one state of selling across state lines actually violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. So it is happening. And the easiest way to ensure that we reduce diversion from across state lines is to have a functioning regulated adult use program here, so that if consumers want to purchase from a regulated dispensary, they actually have an opportunity to do so and aren't funneled into the unregulated market.
Other thoughts? Same question, Jody, maybe to you.
Can you rephrase the question real quick? Just
Yeah, I can give you a slightly different version of it.
okay, got it.
Is cannabis grown outside of Ohio in a regulated context or an unregulated context, making its way into Ohio?
That's an absolute, yes.
And how much? Do you have any idea?
I do not have
I-
any numbers. I just,
Does anyone have any, if anyone's here or on stage has any idea the amount of cannabis that's in the state of Ohio right now, it came from not the state of Ohio, please raise your hand. No one has any idea, and this is part of the point, right?
I'll give you a generalization. I bet you it's
Love to
the
hear it.
majority.
Yes, I
Whatever
would
that
bet,
is.
if I'm betting, I'm probably betting on your team for that particular conclusion. And does moving to an adult use marketplace do anything about that? I think is a follow-up question.
So I think it's not going to eliminate that issue. It may reduce that issue. The reality is that there are cannabis consumers everywhere. Cannabis consumers have their preferences. And so if the Ohio market is going to give folks access to folks who want products from Ohio, then they'll do that. But for example, in college, I used to drive to Kentucky to get a particular type of liquor because it wasn't sold here in the state.
I still do
Ohio.
that.
Yeah.
It's called bourbon.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You should try it.
That's where it's at. I mean, people are going to form shop, consumers are going to form shop. And so if there are specific products that you like, they're in Michigan and you like it enough, you'll drive to Michigan to get it. But if there are enough diversity of products and there are price points that are reasonable, it, I think, becomes less likely that folks are going to be interested in getting products from other places. Now, the reality is that, and I was listening to some podcasts earlier, there are specific markets that folks want cannabis from. I think Ohio wants to position itself as one of those markets that folks want cannabis from. California is already well established as one of those markets. But diversion will occur, is occurring, and will continue to occur. Again, when we talk about reducing the illegal market and unlicensed market, we're never going to be able to eliminate the unlicensed or illegal market. We can reduce it. We can try and educate consumers and folks and give folks resources so that, as Tasha mentioned, they can transition into that market. But I don't think we're going to be eliminating diversion anytime soon with a policy choice alone.
My one concern with an adult use market is commercialization, and then those that are not going to pay for a higher caliber product. So then you have that illicit market, which rises up in communities, and there's no drug dealer that's just selling cannabis, and we see already our drugs are tainted in our communities. So we can see someone feels like they just had cannabis, they vaped it, and they'll test positive for other drugs. So some of the concerns I think we have in local communities is, until we probably have better regulations. So when it's regulated like alcohol, cannabis is not regulated like alcohol right now because our products are all over the place. When you can, and I'll just kind of take this back to our youth. Our youth are addicted to nicotine vapes, okay? So that is the product our young people are using. And we have never had so many young people now use marijuana at young ages. Our average age of use is 13 in Ohio. That's not because they sought out cannabis. It's because they were addicted to a vape device, and cannabis oils are everywhere. So we just have this issue of our products are very unregulated. Those vape devices are much higher than if we had homegrown, so you have this, there's just so much unknown.
Is that an argument for legalization of more things?
No, it's not. It's that I don't think we should expand anything right now in a crisis, mental health crisis, addiction crisis, and with substances of addiction, and when drugs right now at this point really are tainted, so I have caution on any expansion right now until we kind of get a control of the crisis we're on, mental health and addiction in our communities.
Do you think that lack of action on an adult use marketplace will stop the expansion and proliferation of diversion, which is I think what we were talking primarily about, of those unique products,
Yeah.
those higher content products, higher potency, faster onset products coming from other states, whether or not we are doing something to
No, I
regulate.
do
local.
not think it will eliminate or reduce. However, I do think it will decrease perception of harm. So there are some people that will not use because of legality right now. So as soon as that legality is lifted, then we have the perception of harm, which goes down, and youth use goes up, or all use can go up. And it's just kind of a dicey time in Ohio's culture right now with overdose and drug addiction.
Question for Representative Ferguson. You've sat for a little while, and I want to hear from you on regulation and how much regulation of cannabis is the right amount.
Wow.
You get all the easy questions.
Let's just say there are 132 legislators, 99 in the House, 33 in the Senate. And I'm going to be the last one that you get to my level of regulation, meaning on the bottom end of the scale. Like everybody's going to want more than I do. So I just don't think I'm going to be that barrier. So
How do we get that majority to support a framework? And what level of regulation do you think ultimately is convincing to them in a bipartisan way, if that's required?
Well,
What is that required?
well, we're talking about regulating like alcohol. We have a framework there. That's probably like an upper limit, but we just pointed out the problems with the regulations of alcohol in the state as well. Government doesn't really do anything very well, and we don't regulate alcohol very well. So, but that's at least maybe a starting point, is maybe at the alcohol level, and maybe phase it back from there.
Okay. I'm going to leave time. We're not running out of it, but I'm going to leave some at the end for questions that are going to come from online or in the room. And Yana, I know you'll help me if we're getting some of those. So part of the reason we're having this conversation is, again, flashing back to 2009. And the original memo, pre-Cole memo, was the Ogden Memo, which told us that as a general matter, pursuit of federal priorities, law enforcement wise, shouldn't focus on federal resources being used in states for prosecution of individuals whose actions are in clear and unambiguous compliance with existing state laws for those programs. We had some later memoranda, and then we had the infamous Sessions memo that said, I don't want to read any of those, they don't exist. It was a bit of a, we don't need memos to tell me of how to be the Attorney General. Fair, he was the Attorney General, you can take that position. Do we need a version of that now? Either at the state or at the federal level, or putting aside action that might happen at the state level? Is there something that you think federally should be done to relax use of resources for things that would contravene even Ohio's existing medical law? So for example, should federal resources be used in the state of Michigan, north of us, or in Ohio, for prosecution of individuals for possession in a state that, or in a city that hasn't decriminalized, or outside of Columbus, obviously? Maybe Tom, I see you nodding.
Well, no, they shouldn't. And I have lots of views about things the federal government shouldn't be doing in various states. But to answer what I think one of your first questions, do we need a new Cole memo? So if we can go a little bit back in time, the day that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo, as it happened, one of my partners and I were attending a lunch with Justin Herdman, who at the time was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. So, that morning news drops, Cole memo's rescinded, and we get some FaceTime with him that afternoon. And we asked him, in light of the rescission of this Cole memo, does this change your office's enforcement priorities? And he started by giving a little bit of a non-answer, but then he said, our office is focused on marijuana crimes that are diversion across state lines, where there's use of firearms and cultivation, where they're selling to children. And he literally just ticked through all of the Cole memo priorities and then said, so, it really doesn't change a whole lot for us. And I'm not aware that any U.S. attorney changed their office's enforcement priorities after the Cole Memo was rescinded. I think primarily because the cat's not going back in the bag here. I mean, for the federal government to start enforcing federal marijuana laws in state legal markets, I mean, they're now going up against well-established industry players with track records, with community support. And we also still have prohibitions on using federal dollars to interfere in state legal. I think it's only medical markets. So it would be nice to have another version of the Cole Memo. It'd be better if we had, federal legalization. But at this point, I don't know that it changes the dynamic a whole lot, other than we still have banking access issues. We still have issues with patients being able to access, insurance coverage, and employees being able to take advantage of, Americans with Disabilities Act protections if they're using cannabis to treat terminal or chronic conditions. But on a pure industry standpoint,
Are the 8 goals of the Cole Memo still actually being followed then in practice? I mean, are they reflected in the proposed framework that you put forward, and how, if they are?
I think the entire industry is based around the Cole Memo. I mean, that's what really started the proliferation of an actual industry, as opposed to, a more caregiver type model.
But I think it's dangerous to say, feds should just back off. I'm a former consumer protection regulator here in Ohio, and there are agencies like the Federal Trade Commission that really, I mean, one agency can't do it all. You've got to really have that collaboration. And you mentioned with regards to the access to kids. I mean, that's a classic element for FTC in a jurisdiction. And so it's important to make sure that, and even the FCC, because I've got marketing companies out there that are advertising to the cannabis communities that are robo-dialing, that are violating federal laws, that are blowing up your phone and your text these days. So I think we don't want to throw the baby out with bathwater, and make sure that you look at the civil agencies that are out there that may be necessary to avoid some really unpleasant occurrences.
Well, that's a great point, that just because you have states that have legalized something doesn't mean you don't still have illegalities vis-a-vis federal law, but you did actually have effectively a moratorium on enforcement, in particular with the FDA. So the FDA, I think, is maybe the highest example of a federal agency that pretends that a substance doesn't exist because no one has told it is allowed to pretend that it does exist at the moment, with, of course, the asterisk of Epidiolex getting approval, I think, as a mechanism to stop widespread use of non-psychoactive cannabinoids in food products. That's just my personal opinion, but they don't step in yet. Should they be stepping in more? Should that be an example where more use of resources at the federal level could help a state marketplace like Ohio's existing medical, and the possible flip to adult use actually be more successful?
Yes, I mean, they're getting confusion from the White House. The Biden White House drug tests for cannabis and terminates people based on it. You can lose security clearances under Biden administration. So there are very much mixed messages that are out there. But if you put somebody in who's been an effective regulatory agency like the FTC to avoid a lot of the things we talk about with kids especially, it could make the job of the states easier and their programs better.
Kat, you're nodding.
I was just going to say, I agree. Again, I think that every government has a role to play, and so I'm not advocating for the federal government to get out of the way. I want them to join the party and participate. The reality is that we are going to need those federal agencies and resources to help support state markets and even enforcement when necessary. What becomes the issue is that when we have inconsistent policies, it becomes inefficient use of those resources at the federal level. And the reality is that resources are limited. And so we have to put our best foot forward when we're using those resources. I think in the example that you use, the underlying issue is not about cannabis. It's because there are other laws that are being violated. We still need the federal government to do their job as it relates to these other provisions and enforcement of laws, kind of just treating cannabis businesses like any other enterprises.
Yeah,
and that's part of what.
And self-regulation is a part of that as well. The industry itself has and does step up to be able to have levels of self-regulation in order to all work together. I always call it the three-legged stool to protect the community. And it works for business as well as for folks that are interested in accessing those businesses.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of the self-regulation piece and the federal interplay with the cannabis industry, where all of the class actions for Telephone Consumer Protection Act violations, when everyone got robo-texted, if a phone number ever made its way into certain dispensaries' databases, suddenly they're just getting blasted with text messages that were non-federally compliant. And the plaintiffs bar very kindly pointed out to the industry the error of that direction. So they corrected it. Well, I know we're getting close to taking some questions, but just one final topic that I know everyone loves. It's tax season, or I guess extension season, depending on how thick the tax return is. So raise your hand if you've heard of Section 280E of the federal tax code. It's roughly half. So essentially 1980, a convicted drug dealer is then taken to federal tax court by the IRS and proceeds to deduct his various business expenses like a drug scale, a cell phone, a car to drive around and deal drugs, and he wins. And unsurprisingly, Ronald Reagan steps into the fray very shortly thereafter in 1981 and says, that's not okay, and puts a law on the books that says, if you're trafficking in a Schedule 1 or 2 substance that is illegal under federal or state law, you can't deduct ordinary business expenses. This is somewhat crippling on the cannabis industry. I think nearly anyone operating in the industry would say that. Some would even call it the single largest subsidy to the illicit marketplace. When you're taxing the legal operators, you're indirectly benefiting the illegal operators. Thoughts on, is it time to do something, or does that have to be part of a larger bill? Does it have to be the result of a MORE Act? Can the government do something at the federal level on one specific topic, like don't tax these state compliant legalized operators? And is that addressed in the currently proposed version for Ohio? What's our version doing on taxes, and what would we do with the potential tax revenue?
Of course. So first question is an easy one. Yes, the federal government can and should reform Section 280E of the Internal Revenue Code to allow state compliant businesses to deduct normal business expenses. That is, I think, one of the largest drivers of the persistence of an unregulated market. When you have a commensurate regulated market within that same jurisdiction, we hear all the time that it's hard for licensed operators to compete with unlicensed operators, largely because of cost of product. And so you can address that by allowing them to be more competitive, by treating them like you would any other licensed business, and also thinking about, when you legalize cannabis, where are your priorities at? A state like California, I think, did it in large part as a revenue driver, and then they're surprised when they're taxed at every level and their taxes are higher than a lot of other states. So yes, that is something that should happen. It would be an easy thing to do from a substance standpoint, the politics of it notwithstanding. Under our proposal, it's at the state level, a 10% tax at the point of sale, and we earmark tax revenue to certain causes. I talked a little bit about the social equity component. So 36% of every tax dollar goes to the Social Equity and Jobs Program to fund a variety of initiatives. Another 36% goes to a local host community fund to help fill local government budgets if they have operating dispensaries. And 25% goes to a substance abuse and addiction fund to address very specifically substance abuse and addiction issues. The remaining 3% goes to administrative costs of operating the program. And we thought that was really important, because what happens a lot of times is a lot of new money comes in to a government and people start getting their hands in the pot, and the intentions of where that money was supposed to go is not always how it shakes out. So we wanted to be very intentional about where we sent that revenue.
As a legislator, thoughts on that proposal, or thoughts on what we might do with cannabis tax revenue?
So what we would do with the revenue we get, or asking about the actual revising?
No, I think the revenue that we would get, yeah.
Okay.
A state use of funds, which I think is.
Okay, sure. So, yeah, I mean, in our proposal that I had with Representative Calendar, we kind of split it up a few different places. We do a lot of drug addiction and recovery type services that kind of work on some of the other drug issues we have in the opioid space and some other spaces. There's a law enforcement component to actually make sure that we're dialing in on people like drug traffickers. So we shouldn't be going after people that are committing victimless crimes, because again, I don't consider this to be a crime just because someone made it a crime, but we should be going after people that are preying on others. And then the rest of it could go into the general revenue fund just to generally do some other things around this state that would be beneficial, and maybe lowering everybody's taxes so that Ohio is a better place to come. And more people can come here, and then they can use our free adult use workplace.
Great. All right, we will have time for questions, but I want a final minute if everyone can give maybe just their final word on where this is headed or where they might like to see it go.
Sure. So the one thing I will say is that when, knock on wood, our proposal passes, that's not the end of the process. That's the beginning. Particularly in areas like social equity, it is not enough to say, great, we passed this proposal and we fixed social equity. We fixed the arms with the drug war. That's the start of the process. And so, we're hoping that, either by May 28th, something gets out of the legislature, or beginning on May 29th, when we hit the ground to start circulating petitions to get it on the ballot in November, that begins the process of ending failed prohibition and correcting the failed policy of marijuana prohibition, focusing, certainly on the social equity component, moving forward on not just inclusion within the regulated industry, but also the restorative justice aspect when it comes to combating the effects of the failed drug war.
I just hope that, first of all, I think relying on the federal government to do anything anytime soon is just ridiculous. So that's, put it aside, it's not going to happen, which puts a huge burden on Ron and his colleagues. And I would hope that he would, and legislature would look at, we've got a lot of feedback now. Pat, you mentioned this in terms of programs that have done things well and have not, and go back and really look at all of what has happened and how can we correct some of the problems that we saw before and move forward with something a little bit better than what we had before. And I think it could be a true economic boom for Ohio, as Ron was describing, when to have to bring folks in to have a good, safe, regulated industry.
I'm going to echo in part of what Tom and Helen have described. This is the beginning. If and when initiative or legislation gets passed, that's the beginning of the party. But as Helen mentioned, there are so many other jurisdictions that have come before the state of Ohio that there's a real opportunity to study and learn from all of those experiences. And I know that the center is doing excellent work in leading a lot of that research. The other part that I'll add is that it will continue to require to be a collaborative process, and you're going to need bipartisan support. You're going to need law enforcement to be at the table with folks who have sold cannabis illegally, with patients, with community-based organizations to be able to get into the weeds, to get into the details, and have tough conversations. There will need to be tough conversations now and later, but making sure that you have a wide enough table for everyone to participate in those conversations is going to be critically important. And looking forward to seeing Ohio advance cannabis policy reform.
Very good. As I think about adult use, the caution I still go back to is when we make constraints for tax revenues to go into that treatment prevention space. I look at some failed attempts like with the casino industry and promises of where funding is going to come. And that 25% tax revenue concerns me a little bit. You look at, again, what's happening in other states. In Colorado, they estimate for every dollar coming in, they're spending $4.50 to mitigate. I think there was a bailout in California was like 100 million in July to
That
help
was
the
some money, but yes. the city
So
has-
that's helping the legal market compete with the illicit market. So sometimes when I hear these promises of, you know, what all this revenue is going to do for the state, I have a pause of caution. And I also, that 25% for prevention and education, we have a behavioral healthcare shortage right now. Like, just given the amount of treatment we need in mental health and addiction, we don't have enough practitioners in our state. It's taking us 6 to 8 weeks to get someone to be seen in parts of Ohio right now. So again, my caution, is this the right time? Is still, we need an infrastructure that can meet the demands of cannabis use disorder and other addictions that we're already struggling with right now. So I still have that caution on timeline, and are those tax revenues really going to be promised and used in a way that's helpful for our communities?
Final word.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm from Wintersville, population 5,000, and I can walk to 2 medical dispensaries faster than most people can drive to 1. So that's just a case in point of failure within government. We see this or that left or right approach in the state house where you're for adult use or you're against adult use. And I tell people, you have somebody like me. So I've never used before. I've never smoked marijuana in my life. I probably wouldn't do it if it was legal. That's not my point in being here. My point in being here is saying that government fails at all kinds of things. And what I try to tell my colleagues that may not want legal adult use is, you're literally trusting the government that you don't trust on anything else to steer people away from doing the thing that you don't want them to do. Like, you don't see the flawed logic here. And so if we just remove government out of the equation and allow free people to be free people. So that would be my closing thought.
Right. Thank you again to all of you for being here. This is fantastic. I don't want to stop. I'd stay for hours, and that would be selfish of your time, but we might have a couple of questions.
Yeah, we have a question from the Q&A online, and I'll go ahead and repeat that here. So, how will or won't the amended statute affect people currently incarcerated for marijuana-related charges or with past convictions?
Do we need to repeat for online, or they can hear you? Okay, good.
So under our proposal, the social equity and jobs program, which would be established under the Department of Development, would use those funds to fund things like expungements and sealing of records. Unfortunately, because of the way that initiatives have to operate in Ohio, we're limited to a single subject. Otherwise, your proposal gets carved up at the ballot. You got to gather twice as many signatures. There are separate questions at the ballot. We are limited through an initiated proposal in what we can accomplish. So the way that we tried to address that without running into double subject issues was by making sure there was adequate funding for those efforts, spelled out explicitly in statute. So that's where the money has to be sent to fund those efforts. And that's one of the items that I was, had in my head when I talked about, this is the beginning of the process. It's not enough to just cut checks to government agencies to expunge and seal records. We actually have to make sure that that process continues to happen.
We have another one from our online folks. This one comes from Tom Angel, Kyle Yeager, apologies, from Marijuana Moment. This one is for Representative Ferguson. So what does it say about the disconnect between lawmakers and the public that the legislature doesn't appear poised to even hold a hearing on a ballot initiative?
Yeah, well, good, solid question. I will say one of the problems is our redistricting can't get sorted out, so you don't have people able to do our jobs and our legislation. So that's really stalling these efforts. I've shared that with Tom, just kind of looping him into what's going on under the State House. But again, I want to see our legislators be better. I think that every bill that we have should get a good, solid, open hearing, no matter how good or bad that it is, so that if it's bad, we can steer away from it. If it's good, we can embrace it.
One more.
One more from the online audience. If the courts invalidated the CSA Schedule 1 status or the federal government ended prohibition, wouldn't Ohio's medical-only framework still continue to regulate cannabis in Ohio, preventing adult use sales?
It would regulate within the existing medical program. So we would have this sort of bizarre scenario where if you were a patient looking to use medical marijuana, you could choose a very highly regulated and restrictive medical program or a totally unregulated and available adult use program. So the medical program would persist, but it would not prevent the regulation, or I'm sorry, the legalization of marijuana outside of the medical program.
My question is for Ms. Salvo. You expressed concern with the substance abuse problem that's going on in rural Ohio. And I understand Ohio does have a very huge problem with that, but I think about how marijuana has been shown to be an alternative in some situations to opioids for the use. Medical marijuana has been shown to potentially help withdrawal symptoms. I think about the prescription drugs like antabuse and Wellbutrin that are prescribed to treat addictions. I think about all the medical evidence out there that says psychedelics are very effective in treating addictions. So I'm wondering why marijuana is the drug that should not be used to treat substance abuse.
You know what? Thank you for that question. It's very interesting. We have marijuana as medicine here in Ohio, but it's very interesting on House Senate Bill 261. Opioid use disorder is one of those criteria being considered. But if you really go and look at the research, there is not research. There was a Buckhiller et al. Study that was 1999 to probably 2010, and it showed initial reporting that it was effective, but then they extended that study from 2010 to 2017, and you saw a complete reversal, even taking into medical and recreational programs. So it's, if you're really working in that space, you'll see people are not giving up an opioid addiction for marijuana. Like, that's just not how it works. You'll see co-using, and there's quite a bit of research out there on that particular issue. So I would then go back to, we have a medical program, and my goodness, we need to just follow the science. You know, I am not against research, but I think to just say this is the answer for all our problems without the research to guide it, and in particular with those high THC products that we really don't know because we've not been able to research on them, of what is this long-term use going to look like. So my thought is, I'm not demonizing cannabis as medicine or adult use. I just think right now there's a lot of unknowns because we've not had that research component there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess to your point, what if it's bad? Why is that argument more persuasive than what if it works?
I just think in our society, we, for the last couple of years, follow the science, follow the research. We have other states that are moving in this direction. Hopefully we can go from a Schedule 1 to a place where we can have effective research on high THC products. And my goodness, I think we should follow that, you know, but to make movement before that happens in a state that really is riddled with addiction is concerning.
I just want to share something with kind of this discussion here. So we have the FDA that approves something, whatever it is, marijuana is approved in situations. So you have this entity that approves it. We have doctors that get licensed, that go to how much school to do these things. They have the thought process, I should prescribe this. Then we have a person, an adult, that should be able to make their own decisions in their own life for how they're going to medicate themselves. And yet government is now jumping in and saying, nope, we're going to get between all these three things, these mechanisms that we already have in place, and insert ourselves in between the doctor-patient relationship. And I just personally think we should keep things between a doctor and a patient. So in all of those things that you talked about.
I think the difficult thing there, though, is it's not a doctor prescribing and telling someone what amount, what usage, what form. They're just saying you qualify to receive marijuana as medicine. So then you have someone without the education going in, and I think we heard that on the first panel. Is it THC? Is it CBD? Is it under 5%? Is it 70%? You know,
Yeah, and of course they can't prescribe because they'd lose their license to
Correct.
prescribe if they did.
correct.
It's
But
not
I
regulated.
mean, those are some of those issues I think that we really need to have addressed. Like, we need education if we have marijuana as medicine, so we know, you know, what is effective.
Yana, I think we're at time. I threatened we could actually go forever, and we really could. This is a great group at the end. Wouldn't give up, but again, thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to the.